The void between stars is not empty. It breathes. Drath had learned this in his first campaign, 30 years ago, when he had stood on the command deck of a frigate half the size of the flagship he now commanded and watched the gas giant implode under the weight of Vorak firepower. Even then, even as a junior tactician with only 2 confirmed planetary subjugations to his name, he had understood that space was not a backdrop. It was a participant. It recorded what happened within it the way scar tissue records old wounds. He stood now at the forward observation arc of the Unbroken Dominion, flagship of the Third Armada, and watched the Keth system resolve itself out of the dark. 12 worlds, 4 billion inhabitants. Gone. The stars here were dense and warm-colored, amber and rust, the kind of stellar neighborhood that produced carbon-rich planets with thick atmospheres and slow, complicated ecologies. The Keth had evolved on the Third World, a humid, heavy-gravity planet that had produced beings of surprising resilience, 4-limbed, soft-bodied, with nervous systems so redundant that you could remove 3 of their 4 primary ganglia and they would still function, still work, still pay tribute. Drath had always privately respected the Keth, not admired. A Vorak did not admire lesser species, but respected the way you might respect a tool that never broke under pressure. Now they were gone, and the system around their worlds was immaculate. That was a word that kept surfacing in Drath's 4 minds as the sensor arrays fed him data across all frequencies simultaneously. Immaculate, not destroyed, not evacuated, not converted, simply absent. The cities of the Keth Third World were visible from orbit, perfectly intact, their power grids cold but undamaged, their streets empty in a way that streets are empty at the end of a concept rather than at the end of a day. Sub-Commander Vreth approached from the tactical station, her armored bulk moving with a careful efficiency that distinguished officers who had survived more than 20 engagements from those who had survived fewer. She carried a data slate in 2 of her 6 remaining functioning limbs. She had lost 2 in the Palassa campaign, a distinction that only elevated her status. Atmospheric analysis on the Third World is complete. Oxygen-nitrogen balance unchanged. Surface temperature nominal. Microbial life still present in soil samples gathered by drone. The Keth vanished, but their microbes did not. Drath processes through all 4 of his cerebral nodes simultaneously. The first brain cataloged the tactical implications. The second cross-referenced the 6,000 years of Vorak military history encoded in his genetic combat memory. The third ran probability matrices on known methods of mass disappearance. The fourth simply sat with the strangeness of it, which was not a military function, but which Drath had long since learned to treat as a form of intelligence. If their microbes remain, he said, then the Keth were removed, not erased. Something selected them specifically. Something knew what a Keth was and took only that. Yes, Commander, that implies intelligence. That implies purpose. Yes, Commander. Begin surface survey of all 12 worlds simultaneously. I want every squad of ground units equipped with full combat arrays. I want sensor packages calibrated for non-standard energy signatures, non-standard gravitational readings, non-standard anything. If a rock has moved since the last tribute cycle, I want to know about it. Begin now. Vreth moved away. Drath remained at the observation arc. The amber star at the center of the Keth system burned without concern. It had been burning for 4 billion years and would burn for 4 billion more, and the disappearance of 4 billion beings from the world it warmed had not disturbed it in the slightest. Drath found this thought neither comforting nor disturbing. It was simply a data point. The universe was indifferent to the Vorak, which was why the Vorak had decided, 6,000 years ago, to make the universe afraid of them instead. They had largely succeeded. The ground surveys took 3 standard days. Drath spent those days reviewing the data as it came in from all 12 worlds simultaneously, his 4 brains parsing streams in parallel, flagging anomalies, discarding the mundane. There was a great deal that was mundane. Abandoned food preparation facilities, empty transport vehicles parked in perfect order, as if their operators had simply stepped away for a moment and not yet returned. Administrative records intact up to a date precisely 47 standard days before the tribute collection fleet had arrived. Then nothing. No final transmissions. No distress signals. No last entries in administrative logs. The Keth bureaucracy, which had been famously meticulous, had simply stopped mid-sentence 47 days ago. The anomaly that broke the pattern came from the Seventh World. The Seventh World of the Keth system was a cold, sparse place, an outer system world of nitrogen ice, and exposed geology that the Keth had colonized late in their expansion, primarily for its mineral wealth. Its population had been thin, perhaps 40 million beings in total, mostly working the deep mines that honeycombed its crust. The survey team that reached the deepest of those mines sent their report with flag code that Drath had not seen used in his career. Contact evidence and unattributable. He descended to the Seventh World personally, with a complement of 50 of his finest soldiers. The Vorak soldier is a thing built over generations of selective pressure, both natural and deliberate. 8 limbs provide a stability and multidirectional combat capacity that 4-limbed species cannot match. The armored plating, grown from the same biological process that produces the outer carapace, thickens with age and hardens with combat exposure. The immune response of a species that evolved in contested territory, each wound making survivors slightly more difficult to wound again. They move through the mine corridors in standard assault formation, weapons deployed, 4-brain processing running at full combat tempo, and Drath at the center where the commander belongs. Deep, enough in the formation to receive protection, elevated enough in position to override any subordinate's decision instantly. The mine was cold and dark and perfectly empty. The Vorak lights cut through the dark easily. They found the mining equipment in place. Tools set down mid-operation, ore hauling vehicles loaded and waiting at their stations. The Keth had been working when whatever happened. 3 kilometers down, they found the chamber. It was not a Keth construction. The mine shaft opened, without warning and without apparent excavation, into a spherical space approximately 400 meters across. The walls of the sphere were smooth in a way that no natural geological process and no known Keth technology could produce. Smooth at a molecular level, the survey drones confirmed, as if the rock had been rearranged atom by atom into a perfect curve. The sphere was empty, but its walls were not. Across every centimeter of the interior surface, in a medium that was neither paint nor carving nor any identifiable form of inscription, there was pattern. Drath stood at the entrance point where the mine shaft opened into the sphere and looked up and around and down at a continuous design that covered every surface, without repetition, without obvious symmetry, and without any element that corresponded to any symbol system in the Vorak's vast archive of catalog species communication. It was not language, or rather, his 4th brain offered this, and he suppressed his instinct to dismiss it. It was not any kind of language that had been designed to be read. Record everything, he said. Full spectrum, all formats. Nothing interpreted, nothing summarized. Raw data only. They recorded for 6 hours. Then Drath stood in the center of the sphere, turning slowly, looking at the walls, and let all 4 of his brains work on the problem simultaneously, without forcing them toward agreement. The first brain said, "This is a weapon, a psychological one. Something placed this here to be found and to disturb the finder." The second brain said, "This predates the Keth. The molecular smoothing of the walls and the medium used for the pattern register as older than the mine that broke into this chamber. This was here before the Keth dug down to it." The third brain said, "The pattern changes. Look at the southwestern quadrant. The pattern, there is subtly different in character from the pattern in the northern hemisphere. Not different in style, the same maker, the same medium, but the content differs, as if this section was added later." The fourth brain said, "We are being watched." Drath spun. His soldiers spun with him, weapons raised, covering all angles in the trained reflex that 6,000 years of Vorak warfare had encoded into their muscle memory. The sphere was empty. The sensors showed nothing. The walls were still. But his fourth brain, the one he trusted most in situations where military logic had already failed, did not retract the assessment. They left the sphere. As they moved back up to the mine shaft toward the surface, Drath noticed that the temperature in the shaft had dropped by 4 degrees since their descent. The sensors confirmed the drop, but could not identify its cause. He returned to the unbroken dominion with 17 hours of recorded data, 2 disturbing atmospheric readings, and a cold certainty that had settled across all 4 of his brains like particular quality of silence that precedes an ambush. Something was here. It had been here before the Keth. It had taken the Keth. And it was still here in the system, watching the Vorak the way the Vorak had always watched lesser species, from a position of complete informational superiority. He convened his senior officers in the strategic chamber and told them what he had found. The Vorak warrior culture has many virtues and several critical constraints. Among the virtues, physical courage so absolute that it functions almost as a form of optimism, the ability to process tactical data under conditions that would incapacitate most species' nervous systems, a hierarchical loyalty that ensures a Vorak unit functions as a single coherent organism even under catastrophic conditions. Among the constraints, a categorical difficulty with uncertainty. The Vorak military mind is built for engagement, for the direct application of overwhelming force to a defined problem. Mysteries are not in the Vorak lexicon as a strategic category. Mysteries are things you dispel by shooting them until they reveal themselves. His officers heard his briefing with the particular stillness of beings whose instincts are pressing them toward a response that the available information does not yet justify. Recommendations, Draft said when he had finished. Full planetary bombardment of all 12 worlds, said Senior Weapons Officer Kareth. If something is hiding on these surfaces, we remove the surfaces. We would destroy the evidence, Draft said. We need to understand what we are dealing with before we engage it. A Vorak does not fire into darkness. This was technically true, though in practice Vorak often did fire into darkness, and the firing usually solved the problem. The assembled officers understood that the situation was unusual when their commander invoked the principle rather than simply ordering the bombardment. We extend the survey, Draft continued. I want the pattern from the 7th world chamber decoded. I want atmospheric and gravitational anomalies on all 12 worlds mapped in full. I want trajectory analysis on anything that has moved through the system in the past standard year. And I want full weapon systems hot across all 900 ships. We proceed as if combat is imminent. We simply do not yet know what we are fighting. The next 6 days produce 3 more spherical chambers on 3 different worlds, each with its own section of the pattern inscribed on its walls. The cryptographic analysis team, a unit of Vorak intelligence specialists whose forebrain processing made them the finest code breakers in the known galaxy, work continuously and produce a finding that Draft read 3 times through all 4 of his brains before he accepted that he had understood it correctly. The pattern was not a message in any conventional sense. It was not intended to communicate information from the maker to the reader. It was something else entirely. The cryptographic team's best interpretation, arrived at with a confidence rating they flagged as disturbingly low, was that the pattern was a record of consumption. Each section corresponded to a set of biological signatures. The sections added at different times, and the molecular dating confirmed that additions had been made across a span of time measured in millions of years, corresponded to species that had once existed in this region of the galaxy and no longer did. The Keth section was the most recent addition, and it was not yet complete. The pattern was a larder. What had taken the Keth was not removing them for destruction. It was storing them. Draft sat with this for a long time. Then he received the signal from the Iron Patience, a destroyer running picket duty at the edge of the system, and the time for sitting with anything ended. The Iron Patience reported a contact, not a ship, not a structure, not any category of object in the Vorak tactical database. A region of space approximately 2 kilometers across, in which the sensors reported contradictory readings: mass without density, energy without a source, motion without a vector. It was the Iron Patience's sensor officer reported with what Draft recognized as barely controlled professional disbelief, as if a volume of space approximately the size of a small freighter was registering as simultaneously present and absent. Do not engage, Draft ordered, and sent the Relentless and the Absolute, 2 heavy cruisers, to join the Iron Patience in observation formation. The contact resolved itself, over the course of 4 hours, into something his sensors could partially characterize. It had mass. It had a thermal signature approximately 8 degrees above the ambient temperature of space. It moved, but not in any direction that corresponded to the application thrust. It moved the way ripples move across water, expanding outward from a center that was also moving, so that its position at any given moment was a function of multiple simultaneous translations rather than a single trajectory, and it was large, progressively larger. The initial 2-kilometer reading was, as the hours passed and the sensors refined their picture, revealed to be merely the leading edge of something that extended back into the deeper dark for a distance the sensors were still working to measure. 40 kilometers, then 90. Then the sensors lost confidence in their own readings and began returning estimates with error margins that made the numbers meaningless. "It's looking at us," said the Iron Patience's commander, a veteran named Osith whose service record was impeccable and whose voice, in this transmission, carried the specific flatness of someone who has made a decision not to feel what they are currently feeling until they have time to do so safely. "I know that's not a reading. I know it's not in the data. But every one of my officers is reporting the same thing, and I am reporting it too. Commander, whatever this is, it is looking at us." Draft's fourth brain had been saying the same thing for 6 days. "Pull back to 10,000 kilometers. Maintain observation. Do not engage without my direct order." "Commander," Asta's voice, "it's following us." The contact. Draft's tactical team had begun calling it the presence in their internal communications, lacking any better term, maintained consistent distance from the 3 observing ships as they pulled back, not matching their speed, not pursuing in any conventional sense, simply remaining present at the same angular distance, as if the space between them had become a fixed relationship rather than a gap to be closed or widened. Draft took the unbroken dominion to position himself with an escort of 40 warships. He brought all primary weapons to full readiness. He positioned the ships in a dispersed engagement formation that would allow any of them to fire without risk of hitting their allies, and he moved toward the presence at a speed that was neither aggressive nor retreating, the pace of Vorak, who intends to understand what he is looking at before he decides how to destroy it. At 5,000 kilometers, the sensors began to give him images that his visual processing centers could partially interpret. The presence had a surface, not a hull, nothing as structured as a manufactured surface, but a boundary where it ended and space began, and that boundary was in motion constantly, flowing and folding in patterns as third brain identified, after a long moment of processing, as similar in character to the inscribed patterns on the walls of the underground spheres. The same logic, expressed in 3 dimensions and in motion. The skin of the presence was writing itself continuously, and Draft understood with a cold certainty that traveled through all 4 of his brains simultaneously that what he was seeing was the same entity that had inscribed those walls, that the inscriptions were not records left by the presence, but extensions of the presence itself, pieces of its thought crystallized into matter and left behind the way a moving creature leaves footprints. "Open communication channels," he ordered. "All frequencies, all formats. Broadcast our standard first contact protocol." The Vorak first contact protocol is not, strictly speaking, a diplomatic instrument. It is a demand for identification and an implicit threat, structured as a question. It has been used 43 times in Vorak history, most recently 900 years ago, and in every case the response had been either submission or combat. Both were acceptable. The Vorak were equipped for both. The presence did not respond. It expanded, not quickly, not aggressively, the way that a living thing breathes, the way that an atmosphere moves around a planet. The presence extended its boundary outward in all directions simultaneously, and the sensor readings from that boundary shifted in a way that Draft's tactical team translated for him as follows. The presence had become aware that it was being observed and was doing something in response to that awareness that was not, as far as anyone could determine, anything that corresponded to any behavior in any tactical database anywhere. "It's tasting us," said Vref quietly from her station beside him. "That's what it looks like to me. It's tasting us the way we taste air in a new environment." "Vorak do not taste air," Draft said. "No, but our biology uses analogous processes to gather environmental data. I am trying to find a frame for what I am observing. Commander, I apologize for the imprecision. Your imprecision may be the most precise description available. Continue." The presence tasted them for 47 minutes. Then it contracted back to its previous dimensions and moved, the ripple motion, the expanding center translation, directly toward the third world, the Keth homeworld, and settled into a stable position approximately 200 kilometers above the surface. Draft ordered the Armada to surround it. 900 warships deployed in a sphere of engagement with the presence at its center. Every weapon on every ship was locked and ready. In the Vorak military tradition, the act of surrounding an enemy and achieving weapons lock is a statement of intent that precedes the statement of violence by a very short interval. It is the last courtesy the Vorak extend before they begin. The presence did not react to being surrounded. It did not attempt to move. It simply existed, 200 kilometers above the cold, empty homeworld of the Keth, its surface continuing its ceaseless self-inscription, and it sat there with a quality that all four Draft's brains agreed on and none of them had words for. It sat there with patience. Ancient, structural patience. The patience of something that has been doing what it does for longer than the Vorak have existed, longer than the Keth existed, longer than most things that now lived in this galaxy had existed. The patience of a geologic process. Draft gave the order to fire. 900 warships unleashed the full spectrum of Vorak weapons technology simultaneously. Mass drivers at relativistic velocities. Focused energy weapons in frequencies from gamma to deep infrared. Concussive warheads designed to generate force effects that could crack the crust of a small moon. Targeted gravity projectors that could distort space-time at the impact point to a degree sufficient to crush any known material. The Vorak had 6,000 years of refinement behind every system on every ship, and in the first 3 seconds of the engagement, they applied the best of all of it to the presence. The presence absorbed it, not deflected, not resisted, absorbed. The weapon's fire entered the boundary of the presence and did not come out the other side, did not produce secondary effects, did not generate explosion signatures or impact readings. It went in. The presence continued its slow self-inscription on its own surface. Its thermal signature rose by approximately 1 degree. Draft ordered a ceasefire before his officers could begin the automatic escalation that Vorak combat doctrine specified for failed first strike scenario. Reanalyze, he said, all data from the engagement, every sensor, every frequency, everything. The analysis took 11 hours. During those 11 hours, the presence remained stationary above the Keth homeworld. During those 11 hours, Draft did not sleep. Vorak need less sleep than most species, and in combat situations the suppression of sleep is automatic and physiologically sustainable for up to a standard week. And he reviewed the data streams from all 900 ships simultaneously, his 4 brains dividing the workload without requiring him to consciously manage the division. What the data showed was this. The weapon's fire had not been absorbed in the sense of being neutralized. It had been incorporated. The presence was not a shield or a hull or a material object in any conventional sense. It was more accurate to describe it as a process, the way a weather system is a process, a continuous event rather than thing. And the weapon's fire had simply become part of that process, had been folded into the ongoing motion of the presence the way a river folds in a tributary. The presence had not been harmed. It had been, very slightly, fed. Draft held this finding in all 4 of his brains for a long time. Then he asked a question that his first 3 brains had been refusing to ask, and that his 4th brain had been asking continuously since the 7th world. What is it waiting for? No one answered. It was not the kind of question that had an answer in any Vorak strategic manual. But the question sat in the strategic chamber, and its presence changed the quality of the air. Draft spent the next 3 days doing something that no Vorak commander of his seniority had done in the 300 years since the practice fell out of use. He read, not tactical data, not weapons analysis. He pulled from the Unbroken Dominion's deep archive, the cultural records that every Vorak flagship carries as a matter of tradition, because the Vorak who conquer a species absorb its knowledge, and he read the histories and mythologies and the biological surveys of the 43 species they had made first contact with, and the 67 species they had destroyed, and the 112 species currently paying tribute, and the records they had gathered from species that were already gone before the Vorak found them. Among the records of the gone species, there was a fragment. It came from a civilization called the Vorak, who had flourished in this region of the galaxy approximately 2 million years ago, and who had left behind stone constructions on 7 worlds before their absence. The Vorak records were incomplete. They had been gathered and translated by a Vorak archaeological unit 400 years ago and filed without particular attention, because the Vorak were gone and the gone could not pay tribute. But they were there. The Vorak had written about something they called the Gatherers. The Vorak translation of the Vorak text was imperfect. The Varesi language used a system of nested symbolic context that the translation algorithm had handled with admitted difficulty, but the core meaning was recoverable. The Varesi described beings or a being or a process. The Varesi word was grammatically ambiguous in a way the translation could not resolve, that had existed in this galaxy since before star formation in this region. The gatherers did not consume in the biological sense. They did not eat matter for energy. They collected complexity. Specifically, they collected the specific quality of organized complexity that arose when matter, over sufficient time and under sufficient pressure, organized itself into something that could perceive and remember and anticipate the quality that the Varesi called, in their nested symbolic system, approximately, the pattern that knows is a pattern. Life, sentient life. The gatherers, according to the Varesi fragment, were not malicious. Malice implies a disregard for the object of harm. The gatherers regarded their subjects with extreme attention. They studied what they collected for what the Varesi described as indefinite storage and indefinite contemplation, which the translation algorithm offered the alternative rendering of eternal preservation and eternal study. The Varesi had known the gatherers were coming. They had known for some time, and they had tried, the fragment suggested, to find a way to make themselves incomprehensible to the gatherers, to make themselves so strange, so altered, so unlike whatever the gatherers recognized as collectible that the gatherers would pass them by. The Varesi fragment ended at this point. Whether their strategy had worked was not recorded. They were gone. Drath sat in the empty strategic chamber in the deep ship night, all four of his brains running simultaneously, and he looked at what the data had given him. The presence was waiting above the Keth homeworld, because the Keth were still there, not gone, stored, inside the presence, in whatever form indefinite preservation took for an entity that had been doing this for millions of years. For billion Keth existed in a state that was not death, and was not life as the Vorak understood life. And the presence was waiting because the Keth system had attracted the attention of the Vorak, and the Vorak were, undeniably, a pattern that knew it was a pattern. The presence had been evaluating them for the last several days. It was going to collect them, all 900 ships, all the hundreds of thousands of Vorak aboard them, and then it would take the collection back into the dark and add the Vorak section to the pattern on its skin and move on to the next species it found, and the next, because it had been doing this for 2 million years that the Vorak knew about, and possibly far longer, and because it was patient in the structural way of geologic processes, and because it had never yet encountered a pattern that it could not eventually collect. Drath summoned breath. "I need you to listen to me carefully," he said, "because what I am about to propose will be rejected by every instinct of every Vorak in this armada, and I need you to understand it fully before you respond." Vreth stood and listened. She did not interrupt. She was, in Drath's assessment, the finest officer he had commanded in 30 years, precisely because she had learned, at significant personal cost, he suspected, given the damage to her limbs and the particular set of her expression, when things were asked of her that she found instinctively wrong, to allow her four brains to override her first responses. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The Vorak have never done this," she said finally. "No, in 6,000 years. No, the War Council will. The War Council is not here. I am here. I am the commander of this armada, and the authority of the Third Armada extends to all tactical decisions within the operational theater. This is within the operational theater." Another silence. "The crews will not understand it," Vreth said. "Many of them will interpret it as cowardice. There will be—" "I know what there will be," Drath said. "I know what it will cost. I know what it will mean for the Vorak in the long term, if it becomes known. These are real concerns, and I am not dismissing them. I am telling you that they are secondary concerns." He paused. His fourth brain offered him a thought that he decided, after a moment, to speak aloud. "We have never in 6,000 years encountered an enemy that we could not kill. We have spent 6,000 years building ourselves into the most effective killing force this galaxy has ever produced. And we have arrived at an enemy that cannot be killed, that is not diminished by being fired upon, that is not threatened by being surrounded, that will simply absorb everything we do to it and continue doing what it has always done. Everything that makes us what we are is useless here. If we continue as we are, we die as the Keth died, and the Vorak become another section of the pattern on the gatherer's skin. Everything that makes us what we are will end. He looked at her. She looked at him. Unless, he said, we become something the gatherer does not recognize. The plan took 4 days to implement. Draft worked with his cryptographic team, his scientific analysis units, his cultural archive specialists, and the engineers who maintained the unbroken Dominion's deep communication systems. He worked with focused urgency that excluded sleep entirely by the 3rd day and required the ship's medical unit to intervene twice with biochemical stimulants that the Vorak physiology could process without long-term damage. Mostly, the presence remained above the Keth homeworld throughout these 4 days. Its surface continued its inscription. At irregular intervals, it would extend its boundaries slightly in the direction of the Vorak fleet, the tasting motion, as Vreth had called it, and then retract. It was monitoring them, studying them, adding them to its understanding of the pattern, that knew it was a pattern, refining its picture of what the Vorak were in preparation for collection. This was the vulnerability. This was the only vulnerability Draft had found in all the data. The gatherer needed to understand its subject before it collected. The spherical chambers, the pattern records. The gatherer did not simply sweep up everything it encountered. It was meticulous. It needed to know what it was taking. It had been studying the Vorak for days, and it was not ready yet. And that interval was the only window that existed. On the 4th day, Draft broadcast a signal, not on communication frequencies, on every frequency simultaneously, at the maximum power output of all 900 ships combined, in a pattern that the cryptographic team had spent 4 days constructing. Not a message, not a demand, not a first contact protocol, something that the Vorak had no name for in their military vocabulary, because they had never made anything like it before. An offering. The pattern they broadcast was constructed from the archives of every species that the Vorak had ever cataloged, the languages, the mathematics, the biological data, the cultural records, the mythologies, the histories, woven together by the cryptographic team's forebrain processing into a structure that was not any single species information, but a composite of all of them, all the patterns that the Vorak had encountered in 6,000 years of expansion, all the knowing they had, gathered in their own collecting, offered freely in a format that the gatherer's own inscribed pattern had provided the template for. They spoke to the gatherer in the gatherer's own language. They showed it what they had. They told it as precisely as they could given the limits of translation across a gulf of millions of years, that they knew what the gatherer was and what it did, and that they had something they had not encountered before, a pattern that had been collecting other patterns, and that was willing to share its collection freely, without being taken. A collaboration. The word tasted wrong in every one of Draft's 4 mouths. The Vorak did not collaborate. The Vorak dominated. But the concept underneath the word, the idea that 2 parties might exchange what each had to offer in a way that benefited both, was not beyond the Vorak's comprehension. They had simply never had reason to apply it. For 18 hours after broadcast, nothing happened. The presence floated above the Keth homeworld, and its surface wrote and rewrote itself, and the sensor readings were what the sensor readings had been for the past week, and Draft stood at the observation arc of the unbroken Dominion, and waited with all 4 his brains, and did not fire a weapon, and did not order anyone else to fire a weapon. And the hardest thing he had ever done in 30 years of warfare was not that, not the restraint, but what preceded it. The decision, made alone in the strategic chamber in the ship night, to set down the only tool he had ever known and pick up something he had never held before, with no certainty that it would work, no precedent to draw on, no genetic memory encoded across 6,000 years of combat to tell him whether he was a fool or a pioneer. 18 hours. Then the presence moved. It did not move toward the Vorak fleet. It moved. The ripple translation, the expanding center motion toward the broadcast array of the unbroken Dominion specifically, and it settled at a distance of 400 kilometers, and it changed. The surface inscription slowed. The ceaseless self-writing on the gatherer's skin reduced its pace, and then became, for the first time since the Vorak had observed it, still. The thermal signature shifted. Not higher. It had risen slightly during the weapon's engagement. It shifted in character, in the spectral distribution of its output, to something that Draft's science team spent 3 minutes analyzing before the senior physicist came to the communication link with the particular voice of someone in the presence of something for which they have no professional framework. It's responding. she said. Not mirroring our signal. Not echoing. It's generating a new pattern, Commander. It's answering. The answer took 6 hours to fully transmit. The cryptographic team worked on the translation in real time, giving draft partial readings as they emerged. The full reading took another 9 hours to compile. But the shape of it was clear within the first 2 hours, and Draft read the shape with all 4 of his brains and felt something that he would later, in private, concede was the closest thing to awe he had experienced in his life. The Gatherer was old, not millions of years. The fragment count in the answer, the number of distinct species patterns woven into its response, was a number that corresponded to a span of existence that the Unbroken Dominion's astronomical dating systems could calculate, but that the Vorak language had no ready word for. The same way ancient species had no word for colors, they had no visual system to detect. The Gatherer had been collecting since before the current generation of stars had formed. It had begun in conditions that no longer existed anywhere in this galaxy. It had watched civilization after civilization rise and flower and vanish, and it preserved each one inside itself, not as a museum piece, but as an ongoing study. The collected patterns were not frozen, the translation suggested. They were maintained in a state of continued existence, for billion Keth, preserved and alive inside the Gatherer, in a dimension of experience that had no analog in the Vorak's understanding of physics. The Gatherer had, in its long existence, never been spoken to in its own language. It had never been offered another collection. It had never encountered, in the millions of years and the hundreds of civilizations it had outlasted, a species that had understood what it was and what it did and had come, instead of fighting or fleeing, to exchange. The concept of exchange, it turned out, was not foreign to the Gatherer. It was simply very, very old. The negotiation took 11 more days. During those 11 days, the Vorak fleet maintained its positions and its weapons readiness. Draft was not a fool, and the Gatherer did not appear to interpret the readiness as aggression, only as the natural self-protective behavior of the kind of pattern it had been studying for the past week. And Draft sat in the strategic chamber with his cryptographic team and his cultural archive specialist, and he negotiated with something that had existed since before the stars that warmed the Keth system were born. The terms were simpler than he had expected. The Gatherer would not collect the Vorak. It understood, through the broadcast, through the days of study, through the exchange that was now underway, that the Vorak were a different kind of collector, and that 2 collectors in the same territory were more productive together than in conflict. The Vorak would continue their expansion through this region of the galaxy. When they encountered species, they would record and archive those species in the fullness of the detail that Vorak cultural absorption had always produced, and they would share those archives of the Gatherer as they went through the broadcast array in the language that the cryptographic team was now improving by the day as the exchange deepened. In return, the Gatherer would not collect species within the Vorak tribute network, and it would return the Keth. This was a clause that Draft had not known he could ask for until the Gatherer offered it. The Keth could be returned because they had not been harmed. The Gatherer's preservation was exactly that, preservation, and because the Gatherer had a use for the Vorak's territorial markers, needed to know which species were cataloged and protected by the Vorak's own system of record, in order to avoid duplication. The Keth, as a species under Vorak protection, could be reinstated in their world. The Gatherer requested only that it be permitted to continue its study of the Keth archives that the Vorak would provide, as it continued its study of every pattern it had ever encountered. Draft agreed. The return of the Keth was not an event that the Vorak language had a word for either. Over the course of 3 days, beginning on the surface of the third world and spreading outward to all 12 Keth worlds, for billion beings simply reappeared. Not in an instant, in the way that dawn comes, gradually then completely. The Keth returned to consciousness in the places where they had last been, in their offices and their mines and their agricultural stations and their family residences, and they found their world intact around them and 47 days of time unaccounted for, and the Vorak Third Armada filling the sky above them. Draft received the first Keth communication 17 hours after the return was complete. It came from the Administrative Council of the Third World, using the formal Vorak diplomatic protocol that centuries of tribute relationship had established. The message was brief and correct and bore the marks of a people who were deeply shaken and had decided that dignity was the only response available to them. They wanted to know, the council said, how they could serve the Vorak. Draft thought about this for a while. About tribute, about service, about the relationship between a species that could destroy anything it could find and every other species in the galaxy. Tell them, he said to his communications officer, that the tribute for this cycle and the next 3 cycles is waived. Tell them we require, in place of tribute, their full biological and cultural archives, compiled to the standard I am transmitting now. He transmitted the Gatherer specification, which the cryptographic team had refined into something the Keth's own systems could process. Tell them this requirement extends across all 12 worlds and is a new standing condition of their relationship with the Vorak. The archives are to be maintained and updated continuously and transmitted to us on a schedule we will provide. The communications officer processed this order without visible reaction, which took, Drath observed, a perceptible effort. Yes, Commander. And tell them, Drath added, and this was the part that his first 3 brains were still arguing about while his 4th brain had already decided, that they are the first species in the history of the Vorak to receive the waiver. Tell them we are telling them this because they should know that what happened to them, and what we learned from it, has changed something. Tell them we are not in the custom of telling species things that benefit those species rather than us. But we are making the custom now, because the universe has turned out contains something that makes the Vorak's customary approach inadequate, and we are a species that does not persist in inadequate approaches. He paused. Tell them that we are working on a new approach. Tell them it may take some time, and tell them that the Vorak do not lose. He turned away from the communication station and walked to the observation arc for the last time in this engagement. The unbroken Dominion was beginning its departure sequence. Around it, 900 warships were reorienting. The great slow turning of an armada that had come to do one thing and was leaving having done something else entirely, something it had no name for, something that had no entry in the 6,000 years of Vorak combat doctrine. The Presence, the Gatherer, had moved to the outer edge of the system as the departure began. Its surface was writing again, the ceaseless inscription renewed, and Drath watched the motion of it through the observation arc's magnification and tried to read what was being written there. He could not. Not yet. The cryptographic team would work on it for years, he suspected. The language was ancient and deep and built on assumptions about the nature of existence that the Vorak were only beginning to apprehend. But something in the motion of the inscription was different from what it had been when they arrived. He could see that much. The character of the pattern had changed, had admitted a new element that was not there before, and he could not be certain, but he thought that the new element was the Vorak, that their 2 weeks in this system, the weapons fire and the silence and the broadcast and the negotiation, had added something to the record that the Gatherer kept on itself, had made the Gatherer in some minute way different from what it had been before they arrived. He thought about that for a long time, about what it meant to leave a mark on something that had been marking the galaxy since before these stars were born, about what it meant to be recorded rather than collected, about the difference between those 2 things, which he was only beginning to understand might be the most important difference in the galaxy. The unbroken Dominion crossed into open space, and the Keth system fell behind. Amber starred in full again. 12 worlds with 4 billion beings returning to their lives in the complicated, slow, improbable way that life returns to itself after extraordinary disruptions. Drath stood at the observation arc until the system was too distant to resolve in the magnification, and then he stood there a while longer, looking at the dark. The War Council would receive his report in 5 days. The report was precise, complete, and unembellished in the way that all Vorak military reports are precise, and complete and unembellished. It would tell the Council what had happened, what had been decided, and what the terms of the new arrangement were. It would not, because Vorak reports do not contain this category of information, tell the Council what it had cost Draft personally to stand in the strategic chamber in the ship night and set down the only weapon he knew how to use and pick up something he had never held. It would not tell them what he had seen in his 4th brain in the moment before he ordered the broadcast, the long view backward through 6,000 years of winning, and a longer view forward into a universe that had just proven it could produce problems that winning could not solve, and the space between those 2 views where the Vorak would have to figure out who they were if they were not only what they had always been. That was not the kind of information a military report contained, but it was, he thought, the most important information the Vorak had received since they first looked up from the surface of their homeworld and understood that there were other worlds and that those worlds could be taken. The first discovery had made them conquerors. This one would make them something else. He did not yet have a word for what. The Vorak would need to build the word the way they built everything. Through sustained effort, through commitment, through the application of all four minds to a problem until problem yielded. They had never lost a war. And the universe, it turned out, had been waiting to show them a challenge that required more than war to win. He found that he was glad he had lived to see it. He found, checking this through all four brains, verify it was not exhaustion or the stimulants or the accumulated strangeness of the past weeks making him imprecise, that the finding held. He was glad. The unbroken Dominion moved through the dark, 900 warships behind it, carrying its commander home through a galaxy that now knew one more thing about itself. That the Vorak, the most feared species in known space, the species that had never lost a war in 6,000 years, had finally found an engagement that their 6,000 years had been preparing them for, not the combat that required more weapons, but the encounter that required more than weapons, and that they had met it, and that they had not been found wanting, not because they were the strongest, because at the critical moment, with the gatherer above the Keth homeworld and the weapons fire absorbed and useless, and nothing in the entire archive of Vorak military history offering even the outline of a path forward, one Vorak commander had used the same capacity that the gatherer itself was designed to recognize and preserve and study, the pattern that knows it is a pattern and chooses, in the knowing, to become something new. The stars slid past. The armada moved through them. And on the outer skin of being older than this generation of stars, in the language that was also thought and also record and also the ongoing life of every species it ever preserved, something new was being written into the great account of the galaxy's slow and complicated knowing of itself. The Vorak, arriving in fury and departing in something that did not have a name yet, but which every species that had ever changed would have recognized, if they had lived to see it, as the first, morning of a different kind of age. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.